Labor remains tight-lipped over when this election will be called, but today Treasurer Jim Chalmers revealed to Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell that he is still preparing to deliver a budget at the end of March.
We are working towards a budget towards the end of March.
Well, joining me to discuss this, what might be in that budget and how the economy is going to wind up affecting this coming election, is Judo Bank Chief Economist Warren Hogan. Warren, thank you so much for coming on the inaugural edition of Campaign Confidential. And for this entire show so far, for the past hour, everybody has been saying, look, all of these different issues, forget about it. It's all going to come down to the cost of living and the economy. We have just seen poll numbers come out suggesting that labor has gotten a little bit of a bounce out of that Reserve Bank cut. What do you think? Is there any more economic good news coming for labor that might make it a good idea for them to hold off on calling that election?
Yeah, good evening, James. Thanks for having me on your show. Look, it's hard to say because the messages are mixed. I mean, the government's getting these incredible results on employment and very low unemployment. But of course, we know that is coming at the cost of living. And that is why this inflation is hanging around. And they're saying that this is their strategy. So it's hard to read the tea leaves. But the bottom line is that for most Australians, they feel like they're paying for the government strategy in the hip pocket. And that strategy is to grow government and to increase the size of government. And of course, that's part of this employment story. The one piece of information that may give them pause to not want to wait until May is that we will get another inflation number in late April. So if they go before that, then they don't have to leave themselves exposed to a high inflation number, which will only reinforce this cost of living issue out in the community.
Well, it seems to me, Warren, that the big problem that the government has is that they've really created a two-speed economy where it used to be mining and everybody else. Now it's government and everybody else. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it's a totally fair assessment. The private sector is madly trying to grow and invest and hire, but the government is crowding them out with their big ambitious plans and their big hiring. We see it on the ground in the SME sector week in, week out. It's not a case at all that the private sector is weak and that the private sector needs to be supported by all this government spending. The reality of the matter is that this government, since it came to power, has increased federal budget recurrent spending by 20%. That is a phenomenal amount, and it takes us to a record level. It has increased personal income tax by almost 25%, because that's how they pay for all this extra spending, is through higher income taxes, which of course is being driven by inflation. So I think this is why the cost of living issue is going to be very costly for them, because I think Australians get it, even if they can't articulate it like an economist can. The reality is the government's strategy to avoid recession and seem virtuous on that front is costing every Australian at the checkout.
Well, and let's be clear here. We have seen two, I think, devastating statistics, I think, for this government's economic management. One is that our standards of living have been dropping for ages now, and in fact, they've flatlined for a long time, longer than this government's been in power, but they're the ones in now. And our per capita GDP, for all the talk they say about, oh, how wonderful it is that we've got more people coming in and the GDP is growing, that's flatlining, and in the face of infrastructure and housing pressures, that would seem to spell disaster.
Well, it is. I mean, it's a complete reversal of the strategy of the last 30 years of Australian governments, led, I would say, by the ALP government of Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, to run a prosperous private sector that was high productivity and growing people's standards of living year in, year out. We have seen GDP per capita fall by 2% in the last 3 years. And we've seen, whether you measure it as real incomes, we've seen productivity, both of those things fall by at least 5%. And this, of course, is a strategy that is at odds with the foundations of Australians' modern prosperity. We're running an inflationary big government strategy whereas we know that the prosperity of the last 30, 40 years was about a high productivity private sector-led economy. And so I think this is one of the most important elections that we've had in a generation, if not longer, in terms of the underlying economic strategy of the two different parties.
Well, Warren, I mean, I think it's fascinating because, and I'll have to go back and check this, but I believe that Dr. Jim Chalmers' PhD was actually written about Paul Keating, and yet it seems to me that the political appetite for reform is dead. Do you feel like the coalition has any sort of embers of reform going on that side, or are they too terrified that they're going to be called out for, ripping money out of this or, helping the big end of town, which is always what the labor rhetoric always is on this stuff?
Yeah, well, I don't know how well the coalition's been going with the big end of town in the last 5 to 10 years, but I think the idea is, and the Shadow Treasurer has made this quite clear on a number of occasions, their focus is going to be on increasing the supply capacity of the economy. Now, this sounds very boring and not all that interesting, but what he's talking about is trying to invest in our infrastructure, in our schools, in our hospitals, our education system, in order to increase the ability of our economy to grow, which is the main constraint here.
And so, yeah, keep going.
Yeah, and the problem that the coalition has is when it comes to size of government, they come out with any plan to reduce size of government, they'll be attacked for what services they're going to cut. And of course, they don't want that to be. So they've actually got to try, I think, to sort of stay away from these big issues, because once they get into government, whether it's this time or the time after, they're going to have to look at this seriously.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Warren Hogan, for breaking down the rather depressing economic picture. Thank you so much for your time.